Think your life is hard? You wouldn't survive a single day in medieval times. Modern comfort has spoiled us, and the realities medieval people faced every day would feel like a nightmare to anyone alive today. Start with food. Forget the movie fantasy of overflowing feasts and giant turkey legs. For most people, medieval meals were dull, monotonous, and sometimes outright dangerous. Eating wasn't enjoyable, it was just barely surviving. Peasants lived on pottage, a thin stew made from whatever vegetables were available, simmered in the same pot for days on end. It was less a recipe and more a recycling system, often filled with dirt, insects, and anything else that fell in. Bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, but it was nothing like modern bread. It was dark, dense, and gritty. Flour was ground between stone wheels, and fragments of stone ended up in the dough. Medieval people didn't have strong teeth by genetics. They earned them by chewing bread that was closer to gravel than food. Worse still, much of that bread contained ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, burning pain, and death. Some historians believe entire waves of witch hunt hysteria were fueled by communities unknowingly eating poisoned bread. Your neighbour wasn't possessed. The baker just made you trip out. Meat was rare, and when people got it, it was often already spoiling. With no refrigeration, heavy spices were used to hide the taste, if you could afford them. If not, you ate it anyway, and hoped your stomach survived. Medieval food safety made the 5-second rule look generous. Drinking water didn't help. Most water sources were contaminated with human waste, so drinking straight water could kill you. Instead, people, including children, drank weak beer or ale because the brewing process made it safer. Kids didn't need fake IDs to drink. They needed luck to find clean water. Fish was common too, but usually dried or salted. Inland towns received fish days or weeks old, long after freshness was a memory. The smell alone was punishment. And after all that, you still had to use the bathroom. Most people relied on chamber pots kept under the bed. Once full, the contents were often dumped straight out the window into the street. Medieval sanitation was less a system and more a public hazard. In medieval towns, look out below wasn't a joke. It was a survival warning. Before dumping waste from upper windows, people shouted "Gardez-lou," a mangled version of the French "Garde à l'eau." It was meant as courtesy, but what came next was anything but. In some cities, this filth could only be thrown out after dark, turning nighttime streets into biohazard zones. Castles weren't cleaner. They used garderobes, stone seats with holes that dropped waste straight down the walls. At Dover Castle, some of these chutes fell nearly 70 feet. Royalty might have sat on thrones, but their toilets were still just holes exposed to cold air and gravity. Public sanitation was worse. Many towns had shared privies or open areas that functioned as outdoor sewers. In London, a handful of toilets were built over rivers, but they were rare and overwhelmed. Most waste simply ended up where people walked. Cleaning it all up was the job of gong farmers. These workers emptied cesspits at night and hauled the waste beyond city walls. The stench followed them everywhere, and they were banned from taverns and markets. Still, the pay was high, several times more than ordinary labor, because almost no one else would do it. Medieval cities reeked. The Thames became so polluted it was described as a living stink. Toilet paper didn't exist, so people used leaves, moss, scraps of cloth, or their bare hands. Earlier Roman sanitation methods were mostly forgotten, leaving medieval hygiene stuck in reverse. After a day of drinking ale to avoid poisoned water and navigating streets full of human waste, you'd already be done with medieval life. But sanitation was just one of many hardships. Forget the fantasy of knights and castles. Most people were peasants, trapped in exhausting routines. They rose at dawn, worked until dark, and repeated the cycle for life, barely earning enough to survive. Farmers plowed with wooden tools pulled by oxen, planted and harvested by hand, and endured brutal harvest seasons under the sun. Records show they burned massive amounts of calories daily just to keep going. Medieval workers didn't train for strength. They were strong because weakness meant starvation. For those who didn't farm, trades offered a way out, at a cost. Blacksmiths spent their lives in smoke-choked forges, slowly destroying their lungs while risking burns and shattered eyesight.
Tanners had it worse, soaking animal hides in urine and toxic chemicals. The work stained their skin, ruined their health, and left them permanently foul-smelling. Learning a trade meant giving up childhood early. Apprenticeships often began before age 10, with children sent away to live with masters. They worked nearly every day for years, earning little more than food and shelter. Career choices were brutal and simple: strong enough to work, or weak enough to starve. Some jobs existed only for the desperate. Link boys guided the wealthy through dark streets with torches. Pure finders scraped up dog feces to sell to tanners. Wages barely kept people alive. Many labourers earned just enough to buy bread for the day. Hard labour and poor diets destroyed bodies fast. Disease was constant, and medicine was mostly guesswork wrapped in superstition. Doctors blamed illness on bad air or imbalanced humours, then made things worse with bloodletting or leeches. Treatment often did more harm than the disease itself. Child mortality was brutal, with many dying before their early years. Those who survived didn't live long. Infections, injuries, and exhaustion dragged average lifespans down, and survival depended more on luck than care. Dental pain was its own nightmare. Rotten teeth were common, and dentistry meant having a tooth ripped out when the pain became unbearable. Even prescribed medicines could be lethal. Substances like mercury were routinely used, poisoning patients instead of curing them. If illness didn't break you, the justice system might. Medieval law was inconsistent, harsh, and terrifying. Guilt was often decided by ordeals, carrying hot iron or being thrown into water. Sink and you were innocent. Float and you were executed. Punishments were meant to entertain as much as punish. Executions were public spectacles designed to instill fear. Hanging was considered merciful. Worse crimes earned slower deaths. Dragging, mutilation, and dismemberment carried out in front of cheering crowds. Public executions doubled as entertainment. Crowds gathered with food and drink, treating death sentences like public festivals. With few diversions in daily life, watching someone die was considered a normal outing rather than a grim event. Justice depended heavily on social class. Nobles were rarely punished like commoners.
They could demand trial by combat, hire skilled fighters to represent them, or pay compensation to avoid consequences altogether. The poor had no such options and were left defenceless against accusations. Prisons were not meant for long sentences. They existed only to hold prisoners until punishment or execution. Conditions were brutal: dark, cramped spaces where inmates were chained to walls or floors. The state provided no food, so prisoners survived only if family members brought meals. Otherwise, they starved. Torture was a routine part of the legal process, especially to force confessions. Devices stretched limbs, crushed fingers, or inflicted extreme pain until prisoners confessed. Truth didn't matter.
Most admitted to anything just to make the pain stop, often sealing their own execution. For minor offences, punishment focused on humiliation. Offenders were locked into stocks in public squares while crowds hurled filth at them. Women accused of gossip or disobedience were strapped to ducking stools and repeatedly submerged, risking injury or death. Law enforcement barely existed. There were no trained police, just night watchmen whose main job was to shout for help if something went wrong. Arrests depended on crowds intervening, not investigations or evidence. Being accused alone could destroy a life. Guilt was assumed, and innocence had to be proven through ordeals or deadly trials. Survival often depended on luck rather than justice. If the courts didn't kill you, war might. Medieval warfare bore no resemblance to heroic legends. Battles were disorganized, savage, and lethal, offering little chance of survival for the average person. War was a constant backdrop of medieval life. Most people lived through multiple conflicts, whether they fought or not. Only the richest knights could afford full plate armour, which cost years of a skilled worker's wages. Ordinary soldiers wore padded cloth, sometimes reinforced with a few metal pieces if they were fortunate. The image of knights in shining armour was rare and misleading. Swords were expensive and mostly carried by nobles. Common soldiers fought with spears, axes, or repurposed farm tools. The deadliest weapon was the longbow, capable of piercing armour at close range. Archers trained from childhood, their bones permanently altered by years of strain. Battles were brutally lethal.
Thousands could die in a single day, often from cold, blood loss, or infection, rather than enemy blows. Even minor wounds frequently became fatal without proper treatment. For peasants, the real terror came between battles. Armies survived by looting the countryside, seizing food, slaughtering livestock, burning crops, and flattening villages. Civilians were left starving, with nothing to rebuild from. Sieges were worse. Trapped towns faced slow starvation as supplies ran out. People ate vermin, pets, and anything remotely edible. Some sieges dragged on for months, pushing desperation to extremes. Disease killed more soldiers than weapons. Overcrowded camps, foul water, poor sanitation, and hunger turned armies into breeding grounds for illness. Many forces collapsed before ever reaching a battlefield. Civilians caught in war zones had no safe choices. Fleeing meant exposure and hunger. Staying meant violence. Women and children were often targeted, and entire villages could vanish overnight. Even away from war, daily life was harsh. Towns stank of waste, rotting food, animal remains, smoke, and unwashed bodies. Trash filled streets or was dumped into rivers. People carried herbs to mask the smell. Hygiene was minimal. Bathing was rare, and many believed it invited disease. Lice were so common that fine-toothed combs were essential household items. Clothing offered little comfort. Rough linen rubbed skin raw, heavy wool itched constantly, and most outfits were rarely washed. People owned only a few garments, worn until they fell apart. Shoes were thin, fragile, and barely protected feet from mud, cold, or injury. Even speaking would be a problem. Middle English would sound almost alien to modern ears, turning basic conversation into confusion. Asking for help or food wouldn't be simple. It might not be possible at all. Privacy didn't exist. Families crowded into single-room homes where cooking, working, and sleeping happened in the same space. Beds were shared with relatives, servants, or even strangers. Wealth only meant more people watching you, not more solitude. Entertainment was scarce and often cruel. Public executions and animal baiting were major attractions. Safer distractions came from travelling performers or storytellers, but those visits were rare and brief.
Climbing the social ladder was nearly impossible. Most people were born peasants and died peasants, owning nothing and bound to land controlled by nobles. With little scientific understanding, superstition ruled daily life. Witches, demons, and omens were taken seriously, and natural events could spark widespread panic. Information moved painfully slowly. News travelled by foot or horse, arriving weeks late or never. For most people, the world beyond their village barely existed. After living through this reality, modern life would feel miraculous. Clean water, medicine, privacy, and basic rights weren't luxuries, they were unimaginable. The Middle Ages may look romantic from a distance, but up close, survival alone was a full-time job, one most modern people wouldn't last a single day doing.